So if we go over to Pryden.gg, a very reliable site that I like to use for other games aside from Honkai Star Rail. On this site, we have a tier list currently for damage dealers, and the first two damage dealers is Jing Wang and Seele. But we know how strong Jing Wang is, and we, talked about him in previous videos. He'll be the upcoming limited character, but we'll talk about him in a different video, so don't worry about it. But Seele, a character that, all of you know how strong is. We constantly seen her in the beta. We constantly seen what she could do and her capabilities. But we're missing another character that a lot of people have been saying that should be up here, and that is Yanqing. He's not in the same tier as Seele as a damage dealer. Now we'll get into why that may be the case, but before we do, I shall just let you know that Rania and Seele are also in the double S category, Rania being the offensive support or debuffer in the double S category, and then Bailu being a very good defensive support in the double S category. Well, we know how strong these two characters are, and we made constant videos about them previously. Let's get into the video. Okay, so Seele, a very good single target damage dealer, right? A quantum DPS at that, and there isn't very many quantum DPSs in the game. Aside from Qingqiu, a 4-star we get for free, Seele is going to be the only single target or pretty much only quantum damage dealer you'll get for your account for a very long time, aside from Silver Wolf coming out in the game, who we'll talk about in a future video, so don't worry. But for overall, for general, bossing, and farming, she's going to be double S, and we'll get into why that may be the case. So her basic attack is damage to a single enemy, dealing quantum damage. Her skill, elemental skill, deals quantum damage to a single enemy, and she gains 25% speed for 2 turns. The 25 speed increase is going to be very important when you're constantly needing to go and attack the enemy in single boss battles, right? So whenever Seele uses her ultimate, she enters a buff state and she deals quantum damage to a single enemy. That buff state that Seele enters can also be entered upon defeating an enemy, and she receives an extra action whenever she defeats the enemy. However, when she's in that buff state, she increases her damage for 1 turn. This damage increase will be on top of the damage increase that she has for her ultimate. To note, if you defeat an enemy in that extra action that you get from defeating an enemy previously, you will not get an extra turn again. And Seele, after using a basic attack, will increase her next action forward by 20%, and this is at her A4 trace. And we'll talk about traces in a future video, so don't worry. This is basically a skill tree. Talent, if you want to call it that. While in the buff state, so the state she has in her ult, and after she kills an enemy, she will have quantum penetration by 20%. That's very important because bosses have a lot of resistance. So being able to penetrate that resistance that bosses have is going to be overall more damage for your character. And Seele has that in her kit, which is very, very good. So she has some pretty cracked out constellations for her kit, but this is a free-to-play perspective, so we don't really need to go over this. But all you need to know is that her first constellation is going to be the most value because she gets an additional speed stack for her kit. So a 50% speed increase will be the max she can get, and that is really massive. So she actually has 115 base speed, and why this is important is because the higher your speed is, well, the faster you'll go in the turn order. So being able to have a high base speed means she benefits from percent speed increases. So these percent speed she gets from using her elemental skill will increase this speed further than it would for a character like Yanqing, who we'll get into, that has a lower base speed than Seele. Now, speaking of Yanqing, he is actually a S+ tier in bossing and A at farming, which we know why, because he doesn't have any AoE damage or any take action after he kills an enemy. So he's going to be overall a S general character, which is an average between bossing and farming. Now, his basic attack deals this much damage to a single enemy, so it's a single target attack, the same multiplier as Seele. He is an ice damage dealer, so keep that in mind. Deals ice damage to a single enemy, and he activates a stance empathetic sword link for 1 turn. After using ult, Yanqing increases the crit rate by 60%. When that sword stance is active, empathetic sword link we went over before, Yanqing increases crit damage before dealing ice damage equal to this much to a single enemy. So that's a pretty juicy multiplier. And a free crit rate increase is very nice. You'll be having more crits overall. Whenever Empathic Sword Link is active, which is a sword stance he gets from using his elemental skill, Yanqing is less likely to be attacked by enemies. So this is a free still for Yanqing. Very important. Whenever you pair him with a character like, let's say, March 7, who gives a shield to an ally, and that ally is more able to be attacked by the enemy. So he'll pair very nicely with March 7. So Yanqing increases his crit rate by 21% at max levels, 50% at the first level, and his crit damage is increased by 15 all the way up to 33%. So you're getting more crit rate and more crit damage on top of the crit rate you get here and the crit damage you also get from his ultimate. So keep that in mind. And when he attacks the enemy, he gets a follow-up attack, which has a 50% all the way to 62% fixed chance to do the follow-up attack. And that attack does additional damage to the enemy. And it has a 65% chance to also freeze the enemy for 1 turn. Whenever you break an enemy's toughness bar with an ice element, you also freeze the enemy. So freezing the enemy stops the enemy from A, doing their special attack, and B, also freezes them so that it delays their action turn, right? So it's going to be very important for disrupting the enemy's turn cycling whenever you do play this game. The frozen target cannot take actions, and they receive an ice dot equal to this much of Yanqing's attack. Whenever Yanqing receives damage, this is very important, the empathic sword link will disappear. Whenever Yanqing gets attacked, this empathic sword link will go away. Whenever you fight against AoE damage dealers, bosses that is, and Yanqing receives damage, which will happen a lot into the early game, effect will disappear. If you use him with a character like Jeopard and you get shielded, let's say you take damage but you're shielded. If your shield takes damage but you don't, does the empathic sword passive go away? Because whenever you're fighting an enemy that has AoE damage and you constantly use your empathic sword link, it's going to go away because you're taking damage all the time. He has a trace which deals additional damage to an enemy with ice weakness. So whenever you're fighting general bosses that have an ice weakness, he'll be very, very good. We already knew he was good before, but this is additional damage on top of the damage he already does. When empathic sword link is active, his effect resistance increases by 20%. In my opinion, this passive is very pointless because, well, you want mostly damage stats on him. And I mean, this only helps for being taunted. However, whenever he does a critical hit, his speed is increased by 10%. This will be for 2 turns. So he has a less speed increase than a character like Seele does, while also having a lower base speed than a character Seele does also. However, he has the opportunity to deal more damage, but it is a 50% chance, around 50% chance to actually land. So keep this in mind. Whenever he attacks a frozen enemy, he deals ice damage equal to 100% of his attack, and he removes the frozen effect on the target immediately. Now, keep this in mind, right? Whenever you do remove this frozen attack on the enemy, you remove the effect entirely. So you stop the enemy from being stunned. So if the enemy has like a counterattack function, and you will be getting hit by that counterattack, sometimes this actually might hinder your performance whenever you're using him on your team. So keep that in mind. And usually, just like Genshin Impact, whenever you activate a constellation, you can't unactivate it, right? So Bennett C6, right? Whenever you C6 your Bennett, you can't really use him with Eula anymore. So for him to be S+ tier and bossing and pretty much lower in everything else makes a lot of sense. He has a lot of damaging capabilities and he does mostly nice damage to ice type enemies. But that's pretty much it. You want to use him against enemies that have ice weakness. If the enemy doesn't have an ice weakness, well, you don't really get to break them and then get the freeze effect. So you don't really get to benefit from the ice damage multipliers he also gets in this kit. So if you're fighting an enemy that doesn't have ice weakness, he pretty much loses a large chunk of his DPS. You also have to keep in mind that he has some RNG in his kit. With the empathic sword link, well, if you don't activate his passive, then you lose out on additional attack damage, and you also do lose out on, a freeze. So that is going to be a nice chunk of his damage, and you're going to land it 50% of the time. I'm not a fan of RNG characters, but if you do land it, it's going to be very rewarding. Now, a character like Seele being a different element is also pretty nice, but having a kit with no drawbacks really, aside from the fact that she gets an additional turn whenever she kills an enemy, really doesn't matter because her base damage multipliers don't change at all. She has very good damage multipliers and it really isn't held back by any enemies. She also has against quantum resistance on enemies. So any enemy that has resistance against quantum or just resistance overall, she penetrates that and deals damage. So that's going to be a very flat damage buff for the character, while also having speed buffing capabilities, having a higher base speed than Yanqing, also having, an extra forward where for basic attack, this character is going to be really immeasurable value on your account, and she's going to hold up very well into the late game. Not only will we have better gear, so gearing will be much more easily accessible, we'll also be able to use characters that have defense down, such as Pela, a character like Silverwolf, who will also complement Seele nicely. We'll also maybe have access to Seele's best in slot artifact, which increases her damage based on Seele's speed, which is going to be very massive whenever you're using her ultimate and you want to one-shot the enemy or deal as much damage as you can. And for her to have a very strong hit, having access to ways to increase her damage, as penetration, speed buffing, pushing up her own action forward, is going to be a very nice addition to your account. And quantum is definitely something that we don't have much of in the game currently. So I understand why she's double S for general bossing and farming, because her value is immeasurable for your account. I overall think that Seele is the best damage dealer character in the game, and I still stand by that. She doesn't have any drawbacks in her kit, aside from not being able to take an additional turn, not being able to take an additional turn whenever she kills the enemy, but that's just a bonus. And with her being a single target damage dealer, you want to really just use her in, well, you could use her pretty much everything because she has damage against multiple enemies because she could constantly take turns, and she also has very nice multipliers to fight against single enemies. This character is really, really strong. But it's going to be the video here. I don't want to discourage that Yanqing is bad because he increases his crit rate, which is very good for early game, and he increases his crit damage. So he's going to be a lot easier to gear for free-to-play players and pretty much any player into the early game. But Seele is going to be a character that scales pretty well into the late game, and also a character that will benefit you in all of the game's contents, not just content against bosses. One last thing, Seele is a very fun character to play. She flows very nicely, and she has a very cool looking design. Her place into the story is very interesting. I'll let you all discover that yourself. And yes, I'm going to continue hyping up the character because I genuinely enjoy this character. Now, lastly, before we end the discussion here, I want to say this. Please stop telling people to not go for a character that they want to go for because you deem the character to be bad into the late game. Well, Seele, as we just went over her kit, seems pretty strong. And as a character that does damage, has penetration, has all these extra damage buffing capabilities in her kit, doesn't really need to get an additional turn because you're going to be looking to take turns anyways because you have speed boosting capabilities and you also have a way to give yourself more action forward in the turn cycling. That alone makes her really good as a standalone DPS character. She doesn't have very many drawbacks, and she is also a character that many people enjoyed from the Honkai Impact storyline. She also pair very nicely with a character like Tingyun because she has a lower ult cost than Yanqing does. Being a quantum DPS makes her very rare because we don't have very many of those. We have Qingqiu. I think Hoyo did this on purpose because we get Qingqiu for free, but she's pretty bad. And so I will leave you all with this. Seele's value is immeasurable, and we went over both kits. Seele being in quantum DPS, Yanqing being an ice DPS who was better against ice bosses. But if you're not fighting ice bosses, he pretty much falls flat and has way less damage than Seele does because he also has RNG in his kit. So I could see why his value is where it stands, and he's not double S like Seele is because he has more drawbacks than this character does. So I'm going to end the video here. I hope you all got something out of this discussion. What character would you go for, Seele or Yanqing? Now, I will say that a lot of people do genuinely enjoy the design of Yanqing. And I think that makes sense. I mean, he is a younger looking, I was going to say femboy, but that's not true. He's a younger looking, male model. And I mean, being able to have male characters in a gacha game, which is normally, mostly known for having a core audience of, people like me. That's very nice. But I'm in the video here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice rest of your day.